Morning, everybody. How is Pittsburgh treating you? I understand some of you might have had a late evening last night. I'm sorry that the weather isn't better, but we're delighted to be hosting you. And I just want to say thank you to the Alliance and to Tom for inviting me to do this, to Elizabeth for sitting down with me and Andrew to talk about what would be helpful. And I have to say it's wonderful to have you all in our town and to be able to talk about the subjects that you're focusing on. I want to start in a place that because I may forget this later, I want to start by saying thank you for the work you do. Thank you, obviously, for inviting me, but thank you for the work you do, not just in terms of the content of it, but in terms of what it evokes. At a time when, as Terry Tempest Williams has written, that she's tired of living in a binary world and of being defined by rural and urban, liberal and conservative, that we need a common language that binds us together rather than drives us apart. And I think you are a force for helping to do that, and I want to thank you for all the work that you do, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I also want to apologize. It is a peril of being a foundation president that you get invited to talk about a lot of things in which you are not an expert, and that never, ever, ever stops us from accepting. But I'm not an expert in conservation, and if I do violence to some of what you know, or if some of what I say feels glaringly obvious to you, understand that I'm speaking from my perspective, working as a foundation head in this town. So let's start. One of the things that strikes me about what we have in common, the work that you do, is you're in the forever business. You are trying to save something for generations in perpetuity. We are as well. We're a foundation set up to exist in perpetuity. But we are in a very interesting moment. And from Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, all the way to Stoneleigh Public Gardens outside Philadelphia, suddenly the notion of, well, I think Yogi Berra said it best. Suddenly the notion of forever feels in play in a way that challenges us, or should challenge us in the work that we do. As I look at it, it's actually a metaphor for what is happening in our culture and in our society. We are experiencing a surprising breakdown in norms across all parts of our society. A couple of ways that I look at that include the rise and reawakening of ancient hatreds that are finding expression in ways that surprise me and sadden me. I'm seeing it in the soul-searing attempts to understand how we define the other in our culture and how we believe we should appropriately treat the other in our society. And we're seeing it in the surprising ways in which we can't even talk to each other. And actually, when I first saw this cartoon a year ago, I thought it was funny. And today I think it's real. We are challenged to find not only a way of talking to each other, but a common set of facts that we can agree on. And accompanying that, of course, this is related to living in a period of rapid change. This is something that people in my field think about a lot, what's happening in the world around us at the moment. And obviously, we're living on an increasingly crowded planet. The UN estimates that by 2050, we'll have about 9.8 billion people on the planet. Most of them crowded into cities, an additional 2.5 billion people moving into cities. So roughly the population of the planet today, give or take a few hundred million, all crowded into cities within the next 30 years. And then, of course, the challenge of climate change and the urgency with which we do or do not react to this planet-defining dynamic. UN, as you all know, recently estimated that we have 12 years within which to act, before which it will be too late to keep the planet from warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. At which point, the changes that the planet will experience and that we will experience will be substantially, if not exponentially, more dire. And we're experiencing unbelievable increases in inequality. The most recent statistic that I read about this is that since 2007, the bottom 90% of the population in this country are worse off than they were 10 years ago. So even though many of us may be feeling a sense of recovery and prosperity, 90% of the population is experiencing the opposite. And this is the continuation of a dynamic that has been bedeviling this society for a generation, and that for many of us in the foundation field actually defines alongside climate change, the challenge of our generation. And it gives rise to strange trade-offs when you're faced with a breakdown in norms and you're faced with the challenges that we are. People begin to think differently about what the solutions to that might be. Pittsburgh has experienced this for a long time. Many of you who have not been here for a while may be surprised to see how beautiful Pittsburgh is today, and that is a triumph of many things, but most of all, it is a triumph of cleaning up the air and the water and recovering our relationship with nature, which was obliterated by a century of industry. But we are still locked into a psychological trade-off that tells us that pollution equals prosperity. So this has nothing to do with national politics. This is a psychology that happens on the ground in a lot of communities, and we see it here, and it can be expressed as jobs versus air, or jobs versus water, or jobs versus health. It's all of those things. We talk about it in all of those ways. We see a similar set of trade-offs happening right now on the national policy front, as an argument is made that the only way to recover economically and to continue to grow is by trading away our air and our water and our relationship with nature. This was supposed to be a graph, so I'll describe the graph. So Yale University recently did a study on how adult Americans view climate change and whether they're increasingly worried or increasingly hopeful about solving it. And they've tracked this actually over the course of about 8 years. And what they've seen on the graph is that the worry line continues to go up and the hope line continues to go down. And as a colleague of mine who works in this field said recently, when societies lose hope on this or any other issue, we lose. So if we are giving up on our capacity to change these issues, we are in dire threat of actually not being able to change them. So this is the situation. I don't mean to be, this is a great and depressing way to start this presentation, but I think it's important to be honest. This is the world in which we are operating, and we face these challenges, and if we're not willing to face it or talk about it honestly, then why are we doing these jobs? So if that's our context, how might we begin to think differently about ways in which we can address them? They're challenging every field, not just yours. But your field has to be thinking about what is the value of conserving land in perpetuity when it may become drought-ridden, or it may be poisoned, or it will be inaccessible except to a privileged few, or it may not even be forever at the whim of some future politician or some future interest group. It's clear that we have to change. We have to begin to think differently about these challenges as they relate to our work across all fields, including in conservation and land trusts. And I've always loved this line, but I've never felt the truth of it more so than now, that we live in a moment where if we really want things to stay the same, if we really want the planet to continue to be inhabitable for humans, and we want our children to enjoy something like the lives that we have enjoyed, then we are going to have to change in our relationship to what we're trying to make happen. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think what's remarkable about the conservation movement in this country is you have been fluid, actually, for a long time in evolving your understanding of your work. So what I'm about to give you is my mental map, flawed, of how I think about this in terms of your movement and where I think the movement ought to go. So this may be the place where I most need to ask your indulgence, since you know so much more than I do. But I see it as really 4 phases, 3 in the past and one facing us. So this is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt talking to the naturalist William Beebe, as recounted by him years later, and he said that he and Teddy Roosevelt would go out into the wilderness or into the garden and look up at the night sky and pick out the Andromeda galaxy, and they would play a game of trying to identify the stars, and they would realize that that galaxy had 100 million suns within it, and at that point Teddy Roosevelt would say, well, now we're small enough to go to bed. It was a period of romanticism about our relationship with nature, and in that phase, in some ways, what we looked at with respect to our relationship with nature was simply saving it from our development, saving it from our expansion into it. In a later phase, we became more pragmatic. We began actually to look at the utility of the land for its physical purposes, and we began looking at saving farmland, and we began looking at the role of parks in creating a livable urban life. And we shifted, not leaving behind the notion of saving the land from us, but also saving it for us, for the future purposes that we would want to put it to use for. In the next phase, I read William Cronin's our essay in 1995 that for me helped define a shift in how I viewed the work of conservation, where he spoke about the problem of wilderness and the romantic notion that separated the natural world from us, because in doing that, it divorced us from understanding that wildness is all around us and that we are in fact part of wild systems, and that very interconnectedness is the thing that makes us want to and need to live in relationship with nature. And so in that moment, we shifted and began thinking about how nature is part of us, and we went to a phase of thinking about saving land from us and saving it for us, but also saving it with us, alongside us. But even that doesn't feel sufficient right now, because it's obviously not making the case. And the question is, what is the next answer? What is the next evolution of this movement that needs to happen in order for it to continue to maintain its dynamic relevance that you are all the heirs to? And for me, it's actually to get rid of the from, for, and with, and simply to acknowledge that what you are doing is attempting to save us. Another way of putting this is those 4 phases are a phase of awe, a phase of utility, a phase of connectedness, and now a phase of survival. I also was thinking this morning on my drive in that it's, in a way, if we liken it to just to one person's health, we went through a phase of thinking about our spiritual health, and then our physical health, and then our mental health, and now we're thinking about just our health, the whole shebang. Now, all of the negative things that I've talked about, I want to assure you, you are not responsible for the whole catastrophe. It is not your fault. However, it is your job to fix it. And I'm only partly having fun with you. Because I think everybody alive today who cares about the sort of things you care about has to assume that it's about more than just the thing you're working on. It has to be actually about the whole shebang. And I want to convey to you a sense this morning, because I know when I talk to groups about this broader subject of the times we're in, a lot of people are traumatized and suffering and feeling challenged and feeling incredibly small. Not small enough to go to bed, but small enough to give up, small enough to lose hope. One of the writers who I really adore on this subject, Rebecca Solnit, has repeatedly said, and this is from her most recent book, Paradise in Hell, which is about how people react in moments of catastrophe in this country. And what she observes is how we come together and the power that emerges from us. We have the citizens that we need. And you can do exactly what I'm going to be talking about and more. So I want to hopefully absolutely leave you with a sense of hope. I really want to talk to you about 3 ways in which I think you can make a substantial difference on these issues. And they're familiar to you, and hopefully I can add some nuance to them in a way that will be powerful for you. But they are place, which I think you're best at, equity, which I think you're trying at, and voice, which I also think you're trying at, but areas where I hope to challenge you a little bit to do more. So let's talk about place for a moment. And here I want to share with you a parable about rivers, about Pittsburgh. For those of you who hadn't seen Pittsburgh in a while, let me ask for a show of hands. I actually can't see you, so this is easy. But I would love a show of hands of people who still had in their heads before they came here an image of Pittsburgh as a gray steel town. So I actually taught a class, thank you. That's a lot of you, or I'm going to pretend it's a lot of you because I really can't see you. But I taught a class at the Harvard Business School 15 years ago where I was asked to speak about a program that we were working on. And the professor of the class, who brought me in as a guest lecturer, asked the class, what do you think of Pittsburgh? And they actually pantomimed being steel workers 20 years after steel had collapsed. And when I moved here in 1991, I've been here 27 years now, that era was already behind Pittsburgh. But Pittsburgh was an incredibly depressed place. Not a place that really believed in its own future. Actually, a lot of places in the country right now and a lot of places in the world are not dissimilar for very different reasons, but we have devalued place in our society, in our culture, and in our economy. Globalization is part of the reason. So is the emergence of technology and the way in which people now define themselves as living in online communities with whom they identify more than they do with the people next door. And even in my field, it is more popular to work on issues at quote-unquote scale at a national level than it is to work on a regional context like our foundation does. We devalue place because we see it as not as significant or as having the impact that other work and other focuses can have. 15 years ago, when Pittsburgh began to look at what was happening with its riverfronts, we noticed something, which was that we actually had an industrial wasteland along our rivers, and the rest of the world was beginning to awaken to the potential of riverfronts. At one point, my then boss, Teresa Heinz, went to the window of our office and looked down on the rivers and at a building that had recently been built that was ugly and cheap and not something you would expect to see on a riverfront, and she said that can't be allowed to happen. And that launched a process with then Mayor Tom Murphy into looking at what could be done on Pittsburgh's riverfronts that would change the dynamic of how we relate with our rivers. So we brought in a guy named Alex Krieger, who is a design guru at Harvard, and we asked him, what would you say we could do with the riverfronts? And at the same time, we had the historian David McCullough come in, and he said, you have a once-in-a-100-year opportunity to change how your city looks and feels and relates to the natural world. And so we asked Alex Krieger how we might do that. He came to town, and he said, Pittsburgh is a fantastic place to be if you're a car. Because all the best views and all the best places were reserved for parking and highways. And a lot of us in this country have this problem. It was the design thinking of a certain period. But that launched us into thinking what a broader perspective might be on how we could relate to our rivers. And today, that's what that same stretch looks like. And all along a 13-mile loop around downtown, we've seen a similar transformation. When I used to take my kids, when I first moved here, to Three Rivers Park, the iconic park in Pittsburgh, and the one place that sort of offered a natural respite in downtown, what you encountered was everything you could not do, which was great when you had kids with you. So today, that's what that same entrance looks like. The riparian zone along the rivers was a sin, actually, but it was the sort of sin committed by people who were focused on rivers as industry. Tom Murphy, the then mayor, recounts how when he was growing up in this town, every child he knew was told, be home by 5 and don't go near the rivers. So imagine changing that psychology in a town. And today, that's what that looks like. This is a part of the North Shore, and today that's been transformed. And again, part of the North Shore, and again, how it's been transformed. So today, we're 80 to 90% done with a 13-mile loop that now is affecting how people think about design on the riverfront. And I know many of you coined this phrase or live by this phrase, but what the River Life Task Force, the group formed to help think this through, realized over time was that they could buy, they could develop, but they also needed to zone. And for the first time, just a couple of months ago, Pittsburgh adopted a riverfront zoning district to protect the quality of development along the riverfronts. In a town where people who were raised here were told, don't go near the rivers. What that helped illustrate was a change in Pittsburgh about what Pittsburgh actually is. An important one, and I'll say why. Not just because it makes it a better place to live, but thank God, I live here, so that's kind of neat. It actually changed how people think about this town nationally and internationally. For about 10 years now, concurrent with this work, we've been enjoying a set of accolades. Some of them are insane. I love the second most livable and the first in the continental US. I don't know about that. Best place for first-time homebuyers, great place for young people, great place in hippest city in Pennsylvania. That's a low bar, but okay. The point is it actually transformed the way in which the city is thought of and the way in which the city's economic destiny began to take shape. And I want to say that what happened here as a result of placemaking, as a result of actually changing our relationship to nature, was a sense of agency that we didn't have. So very quickly, those of you who have read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Eat, Pray, Love, may remember the joke that she shares in there, where she recounts the story of a man who every day on his way to work kneels in front of the statue of his favorite saint, and he prays, please, please, please let me win the lottery. And he does this every single day, please, please, please let me win the lottery. And years go by, please, please, please let me win the lottery, until finally the statue of the exasperated saint moves and grabs him by the shoulders and says, please, please, please buy a ticket. And I have loved that story since I read it, because I actually thought of Pittsburgh immediately. When I moved here, this was a town that believed that its destiny was tied to the big companies that had been its industrial heritage, and to the big foundations which invested here. And the hope was that some other big company would come and save us, or some big entity would come and save us. What slowly began to take root as a result of changing our relationship with the natural world and proving that we could reclaim our rivers was the idea that we could actually be responsible for our own destiny. And today, nobody actually waits for the foundations or the big companies to decide what to do. They tell us. It's kind of irritating, but it's extraordinary in a town where there had been no sense of agency. And what we're seeing actually is that is vitally important from a global perspective, because of the dynamic of people moving to cities, but I know there are many folks in this room who work in a rural context. There is also a dynamic of people looking for not just cities, but places. So small towns, larger towns, cities, and places to locate. And as Bruce Katz and the late Jeremy Nowak wrote about in their new book, The New Localism, actually these are the units of change in the modern economy. And the way in which the economy of these places is growing is in part through the strong sense of place they have as a result of a relationship with nature. So you actually, within the boundaries of what you do, to the extent that you actually think about not just saving a piece of property, but the way in which it defines a sense of place, hold the key to the prosperity of the places that you call home, and you also hold the key to a reawakening in this country of a sense of agency at a time when we are losing hope. So think about the power that you have within your hands. Now, the second area that I think that calls you to work in is to think about how to do that equitably. And of course, the notion of equity is different in every community based on the composition of that community. But here I'd like to tell you a parable about land, and I hope it will encourage you to adopt equity as an explicit mission, as part of your mission, regardless of where you are. Wendell Berry, and if I think of it, I'm going to end with a poem by him, but I think this is one of the most profound short statements from a man who issues them all the time. But this idea that we exist in relationship to each other, and that the smallest unit of health is actually not one solitary person staring up at the sky, having a relationship for a moment with the stars. It's actually us together figuring out how to make room for that in our lives and in our souls. And he captured that in a single phrase, that we have to exist in community. And it actually is woven through everything your field talks about. The videos that I think we're supposed to play express this so incredibly well. All of your materials express this, and you use phrases like a place for common ground, that you hear this all, that we all came together as a result of this project. It's win-win. But when you dig deep into what's behind that for a lot of communities, there's an equity question about who actually gets to enjoy that. So on the other side of the ledger is a set of issues around, well, in your circle of caring, your circle of community, how wide does that embrace extend? Who actually gets to be within that embrace? Is it me? Is it people who look like me? Is it people who talk like me? Is it people who have the background that I do? Who actually wins? And I know many of you wrestle with these questions when you do community work. And I would argue, actually, these are, in many ways, the most essential questions of your work. And unless the answer to these questions is that this circle of embrace includes everybody, then the work is not done and will never be done. So you wrestle with this in some obvious ways, taking nature into urban environments, giving people a sense of beauty in places where they otherwise might not. And by the way, I want to tip my hat to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy for the extraordinary work they do, not only on those things, but on what I'm about to talk about. So thank you. Yeah. And if you, this makes a difference in people's lives. The moment to enjoy something beautiful in an otherwise dreary or drab day. But we have deeper challenges in America's cities. And I would actually argue in America's rural countryside as well. But we're in a city. I'm going to talk about an urban agenda for a moment. We have 13,000 vacant lots in this city. And the question of how to put them back to productive use is a huge one for a community still on the recovery. So we've been working with the Allegheny Land Trust in Pittsburgh on an agenda to actually strip away the development rights from a lot of these lots, put them in areas where they can be more productively used, and allow these lots to be repurposed as green infrastructure, stormwater management, parks, recreation opportunities, and even urban farms. We recently have begun working with a group called Black Urban Gardeners, Bugs, which I love that name. It's the best name of any grantee we have. But they wanted to work with the city on space to start an urban farm and had to go through a ridiculous bureaucratic process in order to do that. We've now, I think, helped pave the way for this to happen more, if you'll forgive the term, organically in the community, for more of those lots to be repurposed and used for farming in places that often don't have easy access to fresh produce. This is actually one of those. Like a lot of American communities in the 1950s, the city of Pittsburgh decided that the best way to manage poverty and, unfortunately, race in this community was to concentrate it in public housing facilities that were, quote-unquote, out of sight and out of mind, so places that were difficult to access. This is a 23-acre site called St. Clair Village in 1955. Looks charming. But there is actually, we've been working again with the Allegheny Land Trust on an opportunity to repurpose this entire site, 23 acres, into what I believe will be the nation's largest urban farm in a community that doesn't have access to fresh produce, that's considered a food desert, and is within miles of a lot of other food deserts. This would be an extraordinary reuse of this property for, I think, a far more beneficial public use. The problem with moves like this, which I'll talk about again in a moment, is that they're very small and very boutique-y. So they're incremental by nature. We can only fund so much of it. Absent systems that allow this to happen on a more regular basis, it becomes a problem. Especially in the environment that Pittsburgh is now enjoying. So as a result of the changes that the community has made over the past 20 years, we suddenly have an affordable housing crisis. For 20 years of my being in the foundation world in Pittsburgh, most of what we were doing was managing decline or trying to turn it around. Suddenly we find ourselves in an environment that is very familiar to some other American cities, which is one of sudden prosperity. A few years back, Carnegie Mellon University, which is the engine of much of our urban growth, decided to move its robotics arm into a neighborhood called Lawrenceville. And this actually became a national attraction in terms of bringing technology companies here. It also, companies like Uber have been attracted as a result of the artificial intelligence and automation expertise at Carnegie Mellon. We're seeing an explosion in these sort of companies in this city as a result of the investment made in Lawrenceville and in the university itself. But what's happening in Lawrenceville is that the people who live there can't afford to live there anymore. So roughly 90% of the folks who lived in rental property are finding it difficult to live in this community any longer. A townhouse that would have looked like that about a dozen years ago has increased from about $50,000 in value to about $600,000 in value. So a 12-fold increase. This is one of the hottest neighborhoods to live in town. And again, what we've discovered is by working with the Lawrenceville Community Land Trust is that there is an opportunity to use the land trust mechanism to carve out affordable housing in a place like Lawrenceville. In Lawrenceville, only 12 houses in 12 years were built on an affordable basis. So we clearly need to turn that around. The problem, again, is what's the system that allows that to happen? In a place like Homewood, which is not far away from where Google has its headquarters here and where companies like Uber are also based, this is a historically African-American neighborhood in a part of the city that we expect at any moment will turn around and become a desirable area for folks to move. It's what we call a weak market right adjacent to a strong market. And here you find an extraordinary number of people who have made a choice that any one of you in this room would have made, which was a choice between paying their taxes on their houses or eating. And the number of homes in this community that are in arrears on taxes is extraordinary. It is not uncommon to find an assessment on a house like this being twice its actual market value. You can buy those houses for about $25,000, but they'll be assessed at $40,000 to $50,000, which is one of the weird ways in which government does harm to poor people in this country. And it is not uncommon for people actually to have a tax lien on that house for roughly equivalent to the value of the house. And how do we turn that around? It's important to consider in a circumstance like this, just as we have learned in working with Native American populations across the country, working with people in the city, you also have to understand what the cultural meaning of land is for them. You probably all have your own definition of what the cultural meaning of land is. In the African American community in Pittsburgh, what we hear a lot is the expression 40 acres and a mule. And you may wonder what that means, but obviously it refers back to the period of history where America, the United States government, gave away to settlers 40 acres and a mule as long as they went and put the land to productive use. Ever since that moment, you know who was not included in that or in any other housing opportunity in the history of the United States? Black people. There has been a string of federal policies ever since then that has from redlining to the way in which the GI Bill was articulated that has excluded as a deliberate matter of policy the ability of African Americans to own land. So when you talk about a solution in a community like Homewood that involves taking away their property, they view it probably rightly as yet another offense and racist offense against their ability to own land. So understanding that cultural context is important, and yet we believe that the land trust mechanism offers an opportunity to help address that. What, for example, imagine if we could find a way to give tax amnesty to everybody who was in that situation in that neighborhood. And instead of taking away property in exchange, putting it into a land trust that allowed shared ownership within the community and benefited the community as opposed to anyone else. I so often think with the work that you do, and this is to be honest, from a funding perspective at this moment, this is what challenges us about your movement. Well, let me come back to that for a moment. That's a cliffhanger. Terry Tempest Williams, who I quoted earlier, when she was writing about Bear's Ears, wrote this, and I think it's a beautiful expression of how she saw the moment that she was describing the agreement to preserve Bears Ears as this clasp of hands across history. If you read that quote for a second, just think about how it might be applied in a situation like I just described, in a very different context, not to preserve an iconic piece of property in the West, but to preserve a neighborhood in a former Rust Belt city in the East. And really, you only have to change one word. If we could do something like that, we could actually have a clasp of hands across history that would give hope. But we have to exchange our idea of how we want to, what we want to reward and who we want to incentivize. So what I was going to say a moment ago is that I do sometimes wonder if in the conservation movement, the focus is so much on nature that you also forget the other amazing, amazing value you bring to the table, which is the idea of public trust and public ownership. A priceless, at-risk idea of a shared destiny and an opportunity to work together and collaboratively rather than independently and at odds with each other. And I think both of these are your products. If you were a business, I would argue that you should be selling them both. Harder to express, equally important. And why is, for those of you who wonder, I'm not in a city, why do I have to care about an urban affordability crisis? Well, first of all, it's happening in exurban, suburban, and rural America as well because of population growth. But let's just think about the city population for a moment. Why is an affordability crisis relevant to the field? It obviously puts pressure on urban open space, leads to sprawl, puts pressure on rural open space, actually entrenches poverty further, breeds disconnection from nature, the very thing that you are trying to save, and leads to diminished support for conservation, period, and I would argue an increasingly unjust society. And the thing that will undo the social sector in this country, the thing that will undo all of us, everybody who cares about creating the society that de Tocqueville celebrated at the founding of the Republic, is if we perpetuate a society that celebrates unjustness instead of addresses it. Which brings me to voice as an act of courage. And here I'd like to share a parable about gas. Good Lord, you're thinking, what is that? So, I think we're really good. I think your field is good, and I think my field is good. The social sector is good at speaking up for the things that are kind of our cardinal virtues. So in the preservation movement, it might be a place like Powder Mill Nature Reserve. It might be the extraordinary farmland that exists around this area, both of which obviously, it feels stupidly obvious to have to say they should be saved. We're also pretty good, not always each organization itself, but the sector is pretty good at standing up for new conservation projects. This is an area called Hayes Woods, one of the largest new parks created east of the Mississippi in the last 50 years, created here in Pittsburgh last year. That piece of property was going to be developed as, it sort of depends on the moment in time, but a coal mine, fracking area, a speedway, and I forget what else. It sits precariously poised over a riverbank. Half of it descends steeply to the riverfront. And if it had been put to any of those uses, that would have been right in the heart of one of the densely populated areas of the city. So advocacy actually helped prevent that from happening. A group called Penn Future took the landowner on to try and prevent that from happening. And an odd thing happened that actually happens when you do your job well on an advocacy front sometimes. They became friendly, and they actually began to figure out how they might work together, and as a result, the park was, for a relatively inexpensive amount, deeded over to the city as a park. Where we're less good is where we get back into this jobs versus thing that I was describing before. And Pittsburgh and much of our part of the country is actually living through this, because we sit on the Marcellus Shale development, and we're seeing an explosive growth in fossil fuel extraction in this region. And the fossil fuel industry actually foresees a day when this region will be second only to the Gulf Coast in terms of being a petrochemical hub in the United States. And so we're seeing developments like this all over the region in formerly pristine land and formerly pristine farmland. And the argument always is it's good for the region, it's good for jobs, and it continues to grow. This is a cracker plant that's being built in Beaver County now. And you begin to see a very different destiny taking shape for the land around here. The notion of 30 to 50,000 wells being drilled for natural gas extraction over the course of the next 10 years to support what could be 4 more ethane crackers, just like the one that I just described. Just one of them, we've calculated, will take our air quality back 10 years in an area that already suffers from poor air quality. And so what we're looking at is a choice in our region about our economic destiny. Is it going to be an economic destiny based on the innovation of companies like Google and Uber and others that you saw in the slides I showed earlier, or is it going to be a destiny based on extraction? And they don't work well side by side. It's very difficult to make happen, but what we're trying to help our community understand is that it is a choice. And you actually will take away the ability to do the innovation agenda, because guess what? Mobile workers will tell you, technology workers will tell you, they don't want to live in a place that has the worst air quality in the country. And they choose not to go, and the companies choose to follow them because they can. They don't have to be here. So ultimately, the question becomes, which future will we choose, and will we speak up for it? And it's very difficult to speak up to powerful interests and to say, we need to think differently about what you're proposing for our community and the impact that we'll have on the land. I think this plays out at a national level for all of us in the social sector, and this is something I unfortunately am asked to talk about a lot, but what does moral courage look like at a time when almost every issue the social sector works on is being politicized? What do I mean by that? I mean that things that this arena took almost as cardinal virtues and obvious values for the longest period of time, be it diversity or protecting the land, suddenly can be described by folks as partisan or political. And I don't think actually to exercise your voice you have to talk about individual politicians or to ever get into the business of electoral politics. You shouldn't be doing that anyway. But not to stand up for your values is to abdicate the responsibility for which you were brought into existence. And it is on And so this is the responsibility of our sector. I have had nonprofit executives say to me, I'm really worried, but I can't talk about, and then they'll fill in the blank with, I can't talk about diversity publicly. I can't talk about conservation publicly right now because a board member thinks I'm being political. When that happens in a society, we have lost the battle for the common ground that we actually so desperately want and that we like to talk about as a goal of our field. So we have to stand up, we have to be willing to speak about our values. I actually, in thinking about this a few years ago, I came across a poem by W.H. Auden called 1939, and he wrote this on the, I think it was the day after or the day that Hitler's tanks rolled into Poland. And part of his poem is, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. There are so many lies in our society, and they are not an artifact of this moment. You know, the picture I showed earlier of the rally in Charlottesville, that is a hatred that has existed in this country for a long time. It may suddenly have found new expression, but the hatred burns within the society, and until we address it, until we call it out, it will continue to do so. So the importance of voice at a moment in history where it feels as though there are so many lies being told, lies about the climate, lies about the value of land, lies about the value of the future, it is important for organizations like yours to speak the truth about your values. I did want to just pause there for a second because Elizabeth spoke about communications, and I think this is a challenge for all of us. You know in your heart what is right. When you reflect on your work, you know in your heart what needs to be said, and you know a productive way to say it. Use the rules that she laid out for you, but say it. Say it, say it, say it. Please use your voice to stand up for the things that you think are essential. When I think about conservation and when I think about land, I actually weirdly think of this quote from Viktor Frankl, who is a psychiatrist, prominent psychiatrist, wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He actually is a survivor of the concentration camps during the Holocaust. And one of his reflections was that there is this moment between whatever stimulates us, whatever aggravates us, whatever drives us nuts, whatever makes us want to react, and the moment in which we respond. And in that space lies all of our human agency, all of our ability to choose a different future. And in that space lies, he says, our growth and our freedom. Literally our freedom. And when I think about what you do is, in a very real and tangible sense, you find that space for a society to actually have that moment collectively. Through an urban garden, through a giant preservation project in the West, through a small project in a hard-hit community to give everybody access to a moment of opportunity. You give people the opportunity to pause before society rushes headlong into destroying what is most sacred and most important to our collective destiny. So, I mentioned Wendell Berry earlier, and I want to end with a poem from him that I'm sorry if many of you have heard, but I think about this a lot these days in the context of folks who are doing the hard work and lonely work every day of trying to save the world. And in a very real sense, that's what you're trying to do. You are trying to save us. And it can be hard, and you can feel broken, and you can feel worn down, and we can collectively feel that, and we can also feel collectively energized, depending on the moment in which we respond. But Wendell Berry wrote a poem called The Sycamore. And if I were better, I would have memorized it, but I've never been able to. This is the poem, and I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but the part that I think is most important for you. In the place that is my place, whose earth I am shaped in and must bear, there is an old tree growing, a great sycamore that is a wondrous healer of itself. Fences have been tied to it, nails driven into it, hacks and whittles cut in it. The lightning has burned it. There is no year it has flourished in that has not harmed it. There is a hollow in it that is its death, though its living brims whitely at the lip of the darkness and flows outward. Over all its scars has come the seamless white of the bark. It bears the gnarls of its history healed over. It has risen to a strange perfection in the warp and bending of its long growth. It has gathered all accidents into its purpose. It has become the intention and radiance of its dark fate. I think the challenge for us in a time when we feel challenged is to similarly become the intention and radiance of our dark fate. The movement that you're a part of, which will not end with you, God willing. The movement that you're a part of has evolved over time. It has endured slings and arrows. It has endured suffering. It has seen challenges before. And it will encounter ones in the future. The question is, will we continue to grow as Wendell Berry's sycamore tree has? Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, who is an iconic Pittsburgh celebrity before his passing, and who's enjoying sort of a renaissance right now, used to say, do not regret the hard things in your life, because they are what have made you who you are. And now, the choice is up to you to decide who we will be in our next incarnation. Thank you for the work that you do.